In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the inner tie rod on this Ford F-150. Just so you know, after this job you will need an alignment. Let's get started. Let's remove the wheel. You would want to use a 21mm socket. If your lug nuts are swollen like mine, because underneath the chrome cap it rusted, you would want to use a 22. And remove the wheel. And now with the wheel off, let's break the jam nut loose, which secures the inner to the outer tie rod. To do this, use a 24mm wrench, slide it on here. We're going to have to turn clockwise. We're looking at the threads backwards here, so if needed, use a rubber mallet on the end of your wrench. Perfect. This is what you're aiming for. You want just the mounting nut or the jam nut to spin, not the entire tie rod. If the entire tie rod, the inner, starts spinning, which does happen, you're going to have to hold it and then try to break this nut free, either now or later, but this does need to properly adjust and lock in. So at this point, this is loose, so we can move on. And we're going to move on to removing the 21mm mounting nut that holds the outer tie rod stud onto the knuckle. Get your socket on here. Take it off. Now you're going to use a hammer, hammer the knuckle until the tie rod pops up. Perfect. Take this out of here. Now we have to remove the outer tie rod off of the inner. I did spray this with rust penetrant already. Should have already mentioned that. It's always a good idea, especially since on this particular application, the threads on the end here are exposed. They will rust and you have to overcome this rust to get the outer off of the inner. Use a 15mm wrench on this cutout here on the inner, and hopefully you can spin this. I can move it back and forth. Looks like it's going to take a lot of force to spin off of here because of the rust buildup. So what I'm going to do is actually put it back into the knuckle, and I'm going to use the leverage of my wrench to twist this inner tie rod off of the outer. Now because I'm not taking the outer tie rod off of the inner, what I'm going to do is count the threads here, and typically I would count the amount of turns it takes to take the outer off the inner and then put it back the same amount of turns. Regardless of what you do, you will still need an alignment after this. So I'm just going to count the threads, make sure that after I'm done with the job, the same amount of threads are here as there were when I started. We're almost at the end here. Take this back out of the knuckle, and at this point, oh, looks like I still need my wrench, but at this point, I should be able to spin the outer off of the inner by hand. Yep. Okay. There we go. There's your outer tie rod. Now let's get this jam nut off of here so we can take the bellows boot off. I'm just going to use a 24mm socket with my impact. Hold the inner tie rod. Get that out of there. If yours is stuck, use some heat, heat it up, then it should come right off as long as you hold the tie rod properly. If a wrench doesn't hold this because it's either rusted or it just doesn't hold on, try to use some locking pliers. The larger, the better. Let's get this clamp off of here. Grab it with some pliers, squeeze it, slide it off. Once you get it off of here, inspect it. Mine is in very good condition. If yours is rusted or it doesn't hold tension anymore, replace it. I'm going to reuse mine. If you follow the bellows boot in, you'll see a clamp that looks like this. This one's kind of hard to see because it's covered in grease, but this is a one-time use clamp only. The best way to get this off, the quickest way, is with a pry bar and a hammer. Put the pry bar up against it. Make sure you don't damage the boot though, or anything else that might be around it. Hit the end of the pry bar. That should pop it off there. Perfect. Once that's off, take it off and throw it away. Now we can grab onto the bellows boot, pop it off of the steering rack, and then pop it off of the tie rod. Sometimes they're a little stuck on here. This one spins, so it's not seized, but oh, there we go. Give it a couple good pulls, and there you go. Set this aside. Now, of course, inspect it inside. You want to make sure that it's not full of power steering fluid. If it is, well, then you have a bad power steering rack. This right here is just old grease that has melted down, so that's no big deal. You want to make sure it's not broken or torn. This one's perfect, so I can reuse it. Now I have a couple different options of removing this inner tie rod off of the steering rack. You can use a tie rod tool that clamps on like this. You can use the tube style inner tie rod tool that basically goes over the entire tie rod, clamps on, and then you spin it off. Or since it has these cutouts, I'm actually just going to try to use a large wrench. You can use an adjustable, or if you have the right size for this, try that. But if I have the option of not using a specialty tool, I will take that option. Make sure the wrench is perfectly seated on these cutouts here. Hit it with a rubber mallet. Most of the time the wrench won't work because it's pretty tight on there. I'm gonna give some pliers a try, see if they grab on enough. Yep, perfect. So looks like the wrench would have worked if it had more of a cutout to grab onto. So if you have some large pliers, maybe that'll work better. Some locking pliers maybe. At this point you can spin the tie rod right out of the steering rack. And there it is. Inspect this area to make sure the threads are still good. The outside of the steering rack is in good condition still here, so everything is perfect. Let's reinstall the inner tie rod, the new one that is. Thread it on all the way till it bottoms out. As you can see, this one gives you some nice larger cutouts to grab onto, so that would have been perfect for a wrench. Okay, that's bottomed out. So now, because I can, I'll take my large adjustable wrench, snug this up. There we go. Just give it a quick snug. You don't want to twist this rack internally. If you do, it will cause damage. So once you snug it up just a little bit, make it nice and tight, that's it. Stop right there. Your inner tie rod should have come with a little packet of grease. The grease that comes is to be put right here on the ball and socket joint. Squeeze out all the grease. And if you feel like it, work it around a little bit to get that grease situated in there. Make sure everything is covered. Perfect. I like to put the last bit of grease right on this ridge here where the boot, the bellows boot, will seal up. It won't get stuck on there in the future when you try to remove it. Take the bellows boot, slide it over the tie rod, and make sure it's seated all the way down on the steering rack first. Make sure it's seated on the tie rod, which both of them locked right in. So let's clamp it down on the steering rack side. If you don't have a new metal clamp, you can use a wire tie. Make sure it's positioned properly, and of course make sure it's large enough, wide enough that is, and sturdy enough to hold this boot on. Once you secure it on here, make sure it's lined up, and to clamp it down as tight as possible, I'm going to use some needle nose pliers. Grab onto it, twist it, this will pull it through. Okay. That's nice and tight. I'm going to cut off the excess so it doesn't dangle around in there. And there we have it. The inner part is locked in. Now let's get the outer clamp back on. Grab it with some pliers. Slide it over. Oh, make sure it's seated properly. Looks like mine is not. There we go. Just like that. This locks on nice and tight. Put the new jam nut on. Slide it on most of the way. I like to take some anti-seize and put it all over the threads here, especially on the end where the outer tie rod will stay and secure itself on. This will prevent it from getting seized in the future. And I also like to put it on the inside part of the threads here. Not that anything is going to be attached here, but hopefully this will coat them and prevent rust from building up. At this point, move the jam nut, work it over the anti-seize so you can get anti-seize inside of the threads of the jam nut also, and coat the area that wasn't coated. Now take the outer tie rod and put it back. Try to estimate the same distance here as there was before. Okay, this is about the amount of threads I had sticking out. So at this point, let's put this back into the knuckle. Might need to move this around a little bit. Put the mounting nut back on, snug it up, and let's torque it to 85 foot-pounds. That's it right there. However, now you want to make sure, in this case, because it's a castle nut with a cotter pin, that the slot for the cotter pin actually lines up. In my case, it barely lines up over here. Regardless of how far you are, always tighten, never loosen to line this up. For me, that's perfect right there. So I'm going to stick the cotter pin through from the front to the back. That way, when it comes time to taking it out, it's a lot easier. You want to bend this over. There we go, just like that. Careful not to hit the threads. So that's locked in now. At this point, we can resecure the jam nut up against the outer tie rod. The anti-seize is going to kind of get all over here, so once you do this, just wipe off the excess. Grab your wrench and make it nice and snug. There we go. Give it a couple taps and then bring the tie rod back so it's level and not at an angle on the knuckle. The rest will be up to the alignment professional to get it nice and lined up. So having said that, let's put the wheel on. Let's get the wheel on. Start on all 6 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 150 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. There you have it. Take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.